seemed really weird having been gone and not here on Sunday. It's like there's just something missing over here on this side, and it just kept throwing me off. And after the first of the year, is it February you guys usually go down to Florida? Somewhere around there, and you kind of get that framed into your mind, so that's okay. You're used to that. It doesn't throw you off as much. But this isn't just part of my groove, and it just kind of messed me up. All right, so we're going to be in Acts 25. We're trying to make up some time, and finally, in these last chapters of the book of Acts, as we go through some of these longer narratives, trying to take some bigger chunks. Last week we were able to do 27 verses. That's the goal for today. I've succeeded at least 2 or 3 times on Wednesday finishing an outline, and that's what I intend to do one more time. So let's go ahead and pray, and we'll get started into this. Father, thank you for this time you've given to us, and thank you for this opportunity to study the Word of God together, and I pray that you would bless this time. Pray that it would be to our edification. Pray that something in us would be an encouragement to us as we look at the life of Paul a little bit more. And Lord, we're just thankful for your goodness to us. Pray that you would bless this evening in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're in Acts 25, and these last chapters of the book of Acts have Paul as he's a prisoner now of Rome. He was arrested when he got to Jerusalem, and since that point he's been under, after it's found out that he's a citizen of Rome, he's been kind of under witness protection, so to speak. It's kind of how this is working out for Paul. And so Paul has gone around, he's preached the gospel, he started churches, he's confronted false religion, he's taken faithful men and he's taught them how to do the exact same thing. And because Paul was faithful, I think it's safe to say, because of Paul's faithfulness, his ministry is probably unparalleled in church history. Nobody comes close to the impact that the Apostle Paul has had. And all of us have been impacted by the Apostle Paul, right? And every single Christian that has ever has been impacted by the ministry of the Apostle Paul. And his faithfulness, though, and his tireless efforts to start churches and to preach the gospel and to go nonstop really stirred up the hatred of the enemies of the gospel, and in particular the Jewish people. And his life has radically changed. His beliefs have radically changed, and these people, the Jews that once hailed him as being the defender of their faith, now hate him because he is the defender of the faith. And so things have radically changed for the Apostle Paul. And we know, as we've noted as we've gone through the book of Acts and the ministry of Paul, the Jews, especially since his second missionary journey, the Jews had just been dogging his tail everywhere he goes, stirring up trouble, stirring up problems for the Apostle Paul. And they're trying to get him killed at different points, at least trying to get him silenced, but every time Paul manages to escape. Now notice here in your notes, on his last trip to Jerusalem, the Jews managed to get him arrested under false charges. And now, for the next several years, he is Paul, the prisoner of Jesus Christ. That's what he's called in Ephesians. Now, this is important to note because I don't know about you, but if I was put in prison for doing the right thing, it would be discouraging enough to go to prison for doing the wrong thing, but at least you understand it. If I kill someone, I deserve to be there, or if I've stolen somebody's car or whatever, I deserve to be there. But to be doing the right thing, knowing that you're doing God's will, and then you end up in prison, that could be kind of discouraging. And we even found in chapter 23 of Acts that Paul was discouraged when he was in prison. And the Lord came and stood by him and encouraged him and told him to be of good cheer. So we know that this could be discouraging for some. But notice here, it'd be easy to be discouraged under these circumstances. But Paul did not see his imprisonment as a defeat. That would be kind of the attitude I would have. Oh, I'm defeated. It's over. But he did not view himself as Paul, the prisoner of Rome. He sees this as an opportunity to preach the gospel to people who otherwise would have never heard it. That's why he says he's Paul, the prisoner of Jesus Christ. Remember in 1 Corinthians, I think it's in chapter 7, that if you're a bondservant of men, you're still the Lord's free man. Well, though Paul's in prison by Rome, he's still free in Jesus Christ. And so he has an opportunity that not too many people have. I mean, who's going to preach to kings? You just going to walk up to the door of a king, knock on and say, hey, I'd like to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to you? I mean, that's not going to happen. You know, you're going to go to the door of the governor and just push the little button because at the gate and say, yeah, I'm so-and-so, I'm a member of such and such church, and I'm just going to come in here, and I'd really like to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to you. Are they going to let you in? No, you're going to be running away because the dogs are chasing you. That's kind of how that's going to go. How in the world do you get to witness to these people who are higher up like this? Well, you have to do it from the inside. That's the only way this is going to work. And so the Lord has worked this out to get Paul on the inside to have the most important people, so to speak, culturally speaking and politically speaking, to give them the opportunity to hear the gospel. Now, this is really remarkable. Now, in the last chapter, Paul had the opportunity to preach the gospel to Felix, who was a Roman governor. Now, in chapter 25, he's going to preach the gospel to Festus, who is Felix's replacement. He's the governor. And then, toward the end of the chapter, going into chapter 26, Paul's going to get to preach the gospel to King Herod Agrippa II. And once again here in chapter 25, Paul is proven to be innocent of any charges that have been brought against him. And though he should be released, we see how God is working out his plan to get Paul to Rome. So notice number one here, we see God's providence. Now chapter 25 opens 2 years after Paul has made his defense to Felix. He's preached the gospel to Felix. He reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, it says. And Felix trembled. Felix got the message, got the point. But he didn't believe. He wouldn't believe. And remember, Felix puts him in prison and chooses to leave Paul bound because he wants to please the Jews. That's what his plan is. He's trying to buy some time. He refuses really to pass any type of judgment. He knows there's no charge that can be brought up against Paul. All the charges are phony. Nothing's legitimate here. But if I let Paul go, then the Jews are going to be mad at me. That's basically what it comes down to. And so he doesn't dismiss the case. He just leaves Paul bound. Now, had he released him, had he let Paul go, Paul probably would have wound up dead in a back alley somewhere. Because the Jews had, these 40 assassins that wanted to kill Paul. But I want you to back up here to chapter 23 for just a moment. In chapter 23 and verse number 11, notice it says, the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. So what was God's plan for the Apostle Paul? It was for him to go to Rome. And Paul was going to get there. That's God's plan. And God providentially uses the indecisiveness of Felix to help keep him safe for this period of time, so that Paul would get to Rome at the right time. Now, we also see another decision that he refused to make. He refused to pass judgment, but you remember what the other decision was that he refused to make? He refused to believe on Christ. Notice here, chapter 24, down to the last verses there, verse 24, it says, after certain days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess. He sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. Did that convenient season ever come? No, look at verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room. And Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So he missed his opportunity. He refused to make a decision. And now 2 years, Paul has been imprisoned in Caesarea, and Felix has now been replaced by Festus as governor. Now we're in chapter 25. Let's look at verse number 1. Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now this was really a customary practice. Caesarea was a Roman fortress city. It was kind of the main hub of Rome for the nation of Israel. And so when a new governor would come to Caesarea and be put in place, it was kind of customary to go down to the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem and try to, how are we going to work this out and get along with each other? That's really what's going on here. And no doubt, as Festus comes in, he becomes aware right away. Here's this guy over here in Herod's judgment hall, his palace, basically. And why is this Jew here? Oh, well, Felix put him there. Why? Nobody knows. But the Jews got upset about him being there, but nobody knows. Nothing was decided on him. He's just kind of there, and we've been feeding him and all this other stuff, and his friends have been coming and going. And so Festus knows something's going on here, and so when he goes to Jerusalem to meet with the leaders there, he's going to have a powwow about the Apostle Paul. And you might think, well, as he goes, he knows who Felix is. Felix was totally incompetent. You ever meet those people that they do something for you the one time, and you say, oh, thank you, man, that was really helpful. Oh, well, it was the least I could do. And you think in your mind, you're right. That is the least you could do. That's Felix. Festus knows this, and so he knows there's got to be more to this. We need to talk about this when I get to Jerusalem. And you might think that after 2 years, the hatred that the Jews had for the Apostle Paul, maybe it would diminish just a little bit. And you'd think so, but unfortunately, that's not the case at all. Notice verse 2. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. So still, after 2 years, they are trying to figure out a way to kill Paul. I think this illustrates very well the sinfulness of the human heart. That a person can be so bound by their sin that they are unable to receive the gospel. It's just totally blinding to them. And in this case, it is their hatred of the Apostle Paul and the message that he was preaching. But as Festus comes to meet with the Sanhedrin, he wants to try to figure out a way, how can we be peaceable? How can we work together to accomplish this goal of having peace within the Roman Empire in this territory? They let him know exactly what needs to happen. We got an idea. Give us Paul. That's their plan. Give us Paul. Bring him here and let us charge him. Let us try him in our court. Now, their plan is very similar at this point to the one they had with Lysias. You remember Lysias arrests Paul, takes him down to the Sanhedrin. Paul's almost pulled in pieces. And so he runs in, ushers Paul out. And so then the next day, these 40 assassins make this vow that they're not going to eat anything for however many days until Paul's dead. So they go to the high priest. They say, now, what you need to do, go to Lysias, tell him to bring Paul down because you want to kind of redo this court case, and while he's on the way, we're going to ambush him and kill him. That's what we're going to do. Well, this is kind of similar, only this time it's without the 40 assassins. This plot is devised strictly by the Sanhedrin. They fully intend, they're not going to be co-conspirators, they're going to be the only conspirators in this one. This is their plan. And so they tell Festus, bring Paul down, we'll try him in our court, we'll just kind of take him off your hands. That'll kind of help give you favor with us. At least that's what they say they're going to do. But really, they want to kill Paul. And so here we find another instance of how God protects Paul to get him to Rome. Notice verse 4. But Festus answered that Paul, you need to turn that off, that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. So basically, Festus says, no, Paul's mine. I'm going to try Paul, not you. I'm the one that does it. And if you want to have any say when I do this, then you need to send somebody down that can accuse him before me. That's how this is going to work. Now, my question is why didn't he just bring Paul with him? It's like, if you guys have a problem with him, I've got him in jail, and I don't have a problem with him. I don't know why he's here. Maybe I'll just take him with me. And let's just kind of, can we figure this thing out? Paul's from Jerusalem, so if nothing comes of it, I can just let him go, and just wash my hands of the whole thing. But notice what he says in verse 5 again. He says, let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man. Notice the next verse. Next word, what is it? Yeah. If there be any wickedness in him. There's no charges. There's no charges. There's no evidence of anything that Paul's done. And now notice down to verse number 11. It says, this is Paul speaking, for if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But, now watch this, but if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. So notice, the fact that he's in Roman custody and the fact that there's no evidence of him breaking the law of the Jews, the Roman law would not allow Festus to deliver him over. There had to be some type of a charge against him. Now notice here in your notes, here we see how God can work providentially through the very laws of government to ensure Paul's safety. Through this whole process, we see God providentially protecting Paul in order to accomplish his plan for him. Who's in charge of the government? Who puts up kings and rulers and who puts them down? God does. And do you think if God is powerful enough to raise up rulers and to put them down to accomplish his purpose, that he has the ability to kind of work through those laws and all the loopholes and things that are there in order to accomplish his purpose? Absolutely he does. And this is exactly what's going on with the Apostle Paul. Some of this almost, why is this going on the way it is? Why does God remove Felix? It seems like he's there with the Apostle Paul. It's 2 years. Maybe just a little bit longer, and Felix might get saved. Doesn't God want Felix to get saved? Is he going to hear the gospel anywhere else? No, probably not. But does God want him saved? Absolutely. But God's just as concerned about fulfilling his plan to get Paul to Rome. And Felix had his shot. He wouldn't make a decision. And so now it's time to move things along here and get Paul to Rome. And that's exactly what's going to happen. But, as you look at this, it's like 2 years. That's a long time for nothing to happen. Now, I think Paul was probably ministering to people. When he's locked up, Felix didn't forbid any of his associates or friends to come and minister to him. So I'm sure Paul's encouraging people and talking to people. But he's got nothing to show for these 2 years. No churches are getting started. And he's there at Caesarea. He can't go anywhere. There's already a church there. Philip, the evangelist, is there. He can't go anywhere. There's no letters that he's writing. There's no books that he's writing. And he's here for 2 years and nothing to show for it. And to me, that just kind of seems like, maybe that's kind of a waste of resources. This is the Apostle Paul here. Couldn't he be out doing something far more important? Couldn't God just open that prison cell and unlock him and just, let him go? Well, yeah. But sometimes when it appears that God's kind of wasting his time and the opportunity, we understand what God says in Isaiah 55. It says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Was God working? Absolutely. Was Paul having an impact while he is there for those 2 years? Absolutely he was. It just didn't look like it. God's still working his plan out. God's plan, according to Acts chapter 9, verse 15, when God first calls the Apostle Paul, is that at some point he's going to stand before kings and bear witness to the name of Jesus. Well, that's going to happen now. He's here at Caesarea, and at the end of the chapter, you know who comes? King Herod Agrippa. He's going to fulfill his plan right there. God's working it all out. And Paul's confident in God's plan and power, and he continues to speak without fear. And so Paul has had a 2-year layover in Caesarea. He's going to have a long trip to Rome, and then he's going to be imprisoned in Rome for 2 years before his case is heard and he's released. And it doesn't make sense. That seems like a lot of wasted time. It doesn't seem like Paul has had much impact. But actually, it did have an impact on the people that were watching and listening. Turn over with me. Keep your place here. Turn over with me to the book of Philippians. Philippians is one of those, we call them the prison epistles. It was one of the letters that Paul wrote while he was imprisoned in Rome the first time. Notice in chapter 1, verse 12. Paul says, "But I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel, so that my bonds in Christ," talking about his imprisonment, "are manifest in all the palace and in all other places." Now watch this. And how many? Verse 14. Many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more what? Bold to speak the word without fear. So notice the impact. Paul's there in prison for 2 years. It doesn't seem like he's having much impact, but this is emboldening the rest of the saints because they're watching the Apostle Paul and they see that, yeah, it kind of looks like a waste of time, like he's just been kind of set aside to do nothing. But he's having an impact because he's still being faithful. And because of Paul's example, many believers who otherwise would have been fearful to preach the gospel are now boldly preaching Christ without fear. You know, there's sometimes seasons in our life when things don't make much sense. Seems like we're just wasting our time. You know, we try to be faithful. We go to church. We preach the gospel to people. We witness to people. We pass out tracts to people. We try to pray. We try to study our Bible. And it's just kind of like, Lord, it just doesn't seem like things are going anywhere. And I'm trying to talk to people and encourage people. And it's just like, Lord, what in the world? Are we just wasting our time here? But we can trust God's providence that He is, in fact, working out His plan, even in those times. All the while that that's going on, people are watching you. They watch, and they will either be encouraged or discouraged by what they see in your life. Say, well, I didn't ask for that. You don't have to. It just kind of goes with the territory. People watch us, especially when they know that you're a Christian. People are going to watch you, and they will be encouraged or discouraged by what they see in your life as you go through various circumstances in life. And this is exactly what we see going on with the Apostle Paul. He's laid away for 2 years, then he's gone on this trip to Rome, and then he's again laid up for 2 years. What impact is he having? A whole lot. It's just not working out exactly the way he thought it would. But it certainly made a very big impact on a lot of Christians at that time and those of us today as we read his letters. Now, secondly, notice here, number 2, Paul's defense. Festus is at Jerusalem now. So he went down to talk to the leadership there, and he's going to be there for approximately an additional 10 days is what he waits. And then he's going to go back to Caesarea, and he's going to take a group from that Sanhedrin, that group of leaders there, verse 6. It says, when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down into Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. So he's sitting on his judgment seat. This would be an elevated platform where he's going to make judgment. It's kind of a symbol of authority that, I'm more powerful than you are. And this is showing us this is a formal hearing. This isn't just kind of a thrown together, fly by the seat of your pants type judgment that's going to be made. This is a formal hearing. He's trying to do everything by the book exactly as it's supposed to be done. Verse 7. When he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. So this trial begins, and Paul is brought in, and he stood before the judgment seat, and all these Jews, however many there were that came with Festus from Jerusalem, they form almost like a bull ring around the Apostle Paul, and just one after another start throwing accusations at him. He did this, and he preached this, and he broke this law, and he defiled our temple, and he's bringing Gentiles in, and he's preaching blasphemy, and on and on. And now, what's the point of a bull ring? It's to intimidate the guy in the middle. You know, they figure if we just keep laying this on at Paul and throwing these accusations, and we get him scared enough, he's going to say something and slip up, and then we got him. That's kind of the point here. But notice, here in your notes, though they try to intimidate Paul, Paul's not worried. They can't prove anything. And he knows that the Roman law is on his side because he's not broken any of the laws. And most importantly, he knows that the Lord is on his side. What does he say in Hebrews 13? Another one of Paul's prison letters. It says, for he has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what man shall do unto me. He says in Romans chapter 8, if God be for us, who can be against us? Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? And Paul has been faithful. He's been working within the bounds of the law. He knows there's nothing that they can lay on him. He knows that there's no charge that they can bring against him. So he's not worried. He knows the Lord's there with him. Verse 8, when he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, turn it off. Give it here. No gist. Give it here. Neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. Now this is the first, Paul's saying, I'm innocent. Haven't violated the Jews' law. Haven't violated Caesar's law. There's no charge. Now this is the first time he mentions Caesar in his defense. And this is going to kind of work itself out. I think Paul's kind of working up to something here. Basically says, I'm not violating the Jews' religion. Why? Because when he's with the Jews, what did he do? He was like the Jews. I haven't violated Caesar's law. Why? Because when he's with those without law, what is he? He's as without law. That's what he tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And so at this point, Festus could just say, you know what? Case dismissed. There's nothing here. Nothing to hold him on. But while Festus is a governor, he's also a politician. And you and I both know politics are not so simple as that. I mean, if something makes sense, politicians are going to make it worse. And in fact, you know what politics are? Poly means many, and a tick is a blood-sucking insect. So you figure that out. That's exactly how this plays out here. And he has another problem. He's the new guy on the block. He's only been in power for 2 weeks. So, and he's dealing with a strained relationship because in that 2 years that Paul is in prison there at Caesarea, Felix has ordered the massacre of many Jewish people in Caesarea. That's why at the end of that 2 years, Felix is removed from office. And Festus is put in place. So he comes in with a really bad situation here because the Jews are really upset at Rome, and now it's his responsibility to try to mend this whole thing. So he can't just let Paul go because that's going to make the Jews mad. But he's also got another problem because he can't really keep holding on to him because there's no charges. So this is a problem. And so he's going to play politician here. And his purpose now is he's going to try, just like every politician does, let's try to make a compromise. Let's try to reach some sort of a compromise here where we can just please both sides and just be on with this. What do we have to do there? So notice verse 9. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? So this is the compromise. Paul, if I judge you at Jerusalem, would you go to Jerusalem and be judged there? It's like, well, why can't you just do that here? I mean, we're here now, just judge me here. But this is kind of his way of trying to make a compromise. Okay, I'll give Paul to the Jews, but I'm still going to judge him, but I'll just do it there. That's his plan. But Paul's not an idiot. Remember what it was that got Paul out of Jerusalem to begin with. It's those 40 or more assassins that had made that vow. And so Lysias finds out about it, and he gets Paul out of there because they were going to ambush Paul in the way to the council and kill him. Well, do you think that's going to be any different if Festus is bringing Paul down to Jerusalem? No, they're going to do the same thing. Paul's not an idiot here. He knows exactly what's going on. The Jews aren't just going to give up. Now, whether Paul receives some sort of an intuition from the Lord that says, don't go, Paul obviously makes the right choice. And he's not going to let either side have their way. This would make it easy for Festus if he went to Jerusalem and was judged, and it would really make the Jews happy if that happened. And Paul's like, I'm not going to please anybody. I'm a Baptist. I'm just going to make you both mad is what I'm going to do. And so notice what happens here. Verse 10, Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. So now he's appealing to the Supreme Court. And Paul could do this because he's a Roman citizen. Only Roman citizens can make this appeal. So this is worked out for Paul. And actually, I think at this point, Paul's kind of getting frustrated at the politics. You know what that's like, right? You have it at work. We have it in our government. All this politics that goes on about getting moved up and all these rules and things that are going on. It's just like, would you just let me do my job? It's kind of what you think. And you get frustrated because there's all this red tape and all this politics going on. And I think Paul's kind of getting frustrated. He knows he's innocent. Everybody else knows he's innocent. But they don't have any proof of these accusations, and they won't do anything. They just kind of keep going back and forth. It's like, for crying out loud, make a judgment already. And this is exactly what he says in verse 11. For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof they accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. He says, look, if I've done something wrong, then judge me. If I've done something worthy of death, kill me. If I deserve it, go for it. But since you're not going to do anything, since you haven't done anything yet, I'm moving this thing up and I appeal unto Caesar. I'll get a decision there. And so he says, I appeal unto Caesar. So he's in Roman custody, and without a charge, he can't be given to the Jews. And he can no longer legally be detained because there's no charges against him. So now there's a problem. They're not getting anywhere. He appeals to the next highest court, which is Caesar, and now Festus is in a tight spot. Because if he were to just say, okay, fine, let's just dismiss this case and be done, then the Jews are going to get mad. Because they want Paul dead. And now because Paul has made an appeal to Caesar, now Festus really can't try the case anymore. It has to be done. Festus has to just stop, dismiss the court, and send Paul to Rome. That's what he's got to do. And so now he's in a bad spot. Because now his hands are totally tied. He's missed his opportunity. Verse 12, Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, that council would be his personal advisors, kind of his legal counsel. You know how it is with law. We have so many law books that nobody could possibly know all the laws. So you have people that are experts in certain kinds of law. Well, that's exactly the way it was with the Romans. And so he has this legal counsel around him. You know, it's like, this is unusual. Paul's just made an appeal to Rome, but there's no charges against him. Can he do that? And is that okay for him to do? And finds out, yep, that's exactly what he can do. So he answers, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. Now, this works in Festus' favor because Festus doesn't have to be the bad guy now. He doesn't have to be the one to disappoint the Jews. Now he can just kind of, just like Lysias, I'm going to send him off to somebody else, and we'll let Caesar deal with it because nobody's going to mess with him. And so it works out. But it's a result of this appeal. Because Paul makes this appeal to Caesar. Now, everything's in place for Paul to go to Rome, where he will stand before Caesar. God's working out his purpose. Now notice here, Festus, number 3, Festus' ignorance. Now the remainder of this chapter is just going to be a setup for Paul's opportunity to testify before King Agrippa. And we'll get into that next week, Lord willing. But notice verse 13 here. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. Now I want you to notice here who this King Agrippa is. This is Herod Agrippa II. His father, Herod Agrippa I, died in Acts 12. Remember, we talked about him a little bit last week, I think it was. He was the one that made the oration at Caesarea, and people said, it's not the voice of a man, it's the voice of a God, and they kept cheering, and the angel of the Lord smote him, and he smote him dead, and he was eaten of worms. That was this Agrippa's father. But he also had 3 sisters. Drusilla, which we saw in chapter 24, which is Felix's wife. He had another sister, Mariamne. That's a name right there. I'm sure she had a great personality. And then his third sister's name was Bernice. Now, that sticks out here. Because in verse 13, who does King Agrippa come with? Bernice. Now, this is kind of weird. Remember, I've told you that the Herods were just a despicable family. Bernice is his oldest sister. She's only a year younger than him. But her husband, and who was also her uncle, had died. And she went to live with her brother. And their scandalous relationship was like the talk, was the gossip of the city of Rome. But she later would become the mistress to Emperor Vespasian. Now, Emperor Vespasian was the general who first tried to besiege Jerusalem to put down the revolt that was going on. I think it was around 68 A.D. And then he was called to Rome to become the emperor, and it was his son, General Titus, who did finally go in, besiege Jerusalem, raze it to the ground, and destroy the temple and all that stuff in 70 A.D. Well, she became the mistress to both of these men, and then Titus was going to marry her, but he couldn't marry her because it would have been politically incorrect at that time. And so he banishes her, and she goes back then to her brother. I mean, these people were just terrible people. I mean, this is a drama story, is what this is. So they're coming to pay courtesy to the new governor. And they come right after Paul's trial, sometime within a month's period of time. And this works out for Festus because he can't send Paul to Rome without some list of charges. If he's going to pass him off to another court, he has to, by Roman law, there has to be something that he can write down to say, this is why I'm sending him. There has to be some charges that he's appealing to. Well, there isn't anything. So this really puts him in a hard spot because Paul has appealed to Rome, but I don't have anything to write down as to why I'm sending him. Can't just have Paul show up at Caesar's house and, hey, what's going on? It can't work that way. And so he has to have this list of charges, and he has no idea about anything to do with the Jewish people. But Agrippa, we find out in chapter 26 and verse 3 that Agrippa is expert in all the customs and questions which are among the Jews. So Agrippa is well-versed. He's kind of his own historian. He's kind of a geek when it comes to the Jewish people. And so maybe he can help out. And this is exactly what Festus tries to do. Tries to inquire at him to have him help him out here. Notice verse 14. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's case unto the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix. He's just going to basically report exactly what's been going on, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him, To whom I answered, It is not the manner of the Romans to deliver a man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Fair trial. Verse 17, Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat, and commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom, when the accuser stood up, notice this, they brought none occasion of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him, and of their own superstitions, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I doubted, that means I didn't understand what was going on, because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. So Festus is a pagan king. He doesn't understand anything that's going on with the Jews. And I think it's really interesting here, he does not know who this Jesus is. He's never heard of him before, except for when Paul mentioned it. You know, that almost seems strange to us, but there's a lot of people today that don't know who Jesus is, other than a cuss word. I mean, it's not the same as it was 40 or 50 years ago. You know, this is like the third or fourth generation that's been brought up out of church. People don't know who Jesus is. But he's about to find out exactly who Jesus is when Paul gives his speech. And so Festus thinks this whole thing's absurd. The Greeks and the Romans didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in anything like that. That was foolishness unto them. And so all their accusations against him are all about Jewish religious matters, and that's not something the Romans have anything to do with. They won't hear those things in court. So he needs to figure out, what in the world do I write down for delivering Paul? So verse 21, But when Paul appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, Augustus is a title, it's not a proper name. It means the revered one. It's a title for the emperor. He says, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Now Agrippa, who knows about the Jewish religion, he's heard about the Apostle Paul and some of these things, and that's kind of the idea here. He's like, man, this is great. I get to hear this guy. I've been wanting to hear about him. And so, verse 22 again, Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. And now we see that Paul again is declared innocent. Verse 23, And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing, with the chief captains and the principal men of the city. Now, with a day's notice, they have really made this thing a grand public hearing. It says Agrippa comes with great pomp. That means he's being ushered in with soldiers and criers, and they're saying, Here comes King Agrippa. And the people are bowing down in the streets. They're giving him the red carpet treatment, so to speak. And he comes in with his royal garb on. He comes in with his kingly crown. And this is a really big deal. He comes with the chief captains. So these are the Roman tribunes. These are the important generals that are over 1,000 soldiers. There's 5 of those at Caesarea. And he comes in with the principal men of the city. These are the leaders of the city under the governor. So everybody that's somebody is at this hearing, and it's a public hearing. And so verse 23, At Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth, and Festus said, and this would be a big public declaration, King Agrippa and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. Now this would be embarrassing. Made this big, got all these people together, really important people. And I mean, you see this man? They brought all these charges against him. But when I find that he committed nothing worthy of death, but when I found out that there was nothing, I called you here to help me figure out something right. He went from being this big star here, now he's like this big. Notice verse 25, But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him. Now notice again, Paul's innocent. This is declared in verse 7, verse 10, verse 11, verse 25. This is the whole point of this section of the book of Acts, is that Paul and Christians are not rivals with the Roman Empire. They're not a threat. And the Christians, they're not revolutionaries, they're not rioters, they just want to believe on the Lord. They want to be faithful to follow Him and preach the gospel and live in quietness and live peaceably with godliness and sincerity and honesty. They're not a threat to anyone. And at this time, preaching the gospel wasn't hate speech yet. A few years from now, this same Augustus, it's actually Nero is the emperor at this time. And in just a few years, after Paul's released, a few years after that, he becomes a hater of Christians and authorizes the extermination of Christians. Both Paul and Peter are going to be executed by this same Nero. But at this point in history, he's still a good guy. He hasn't gone bad yet. Verse 25. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain things to write unto my Lord. And he didn't understand the nature of the charges. He's unfamiliar with the Jewish religion. He's basically saying, look, I gathered all of you here because I need some help. Help me figure this thing out, what I need to write down. Verse 26, wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. He says, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write down. I don't know what charges to write. I have to send him because he's appealed, but I can't send him without charges. So what do I write? Maybe Agrippa can help me out. He's the expert, so he'll figure this whole thing out. He'll hear the case, and he'll tell me what needs to be written down. But he didn't have anything to write because Paul's innocent. All they can do is try to get some information and put on a show to make it look like they're in power. But who's really in charge here? The Lord is. You got all these people coming out here, all the important people of the city, they're there, a king is there, and everybody thinks he's so important and trying to make Paul look like he's this little insignificant guy in the story. But actually, it's flip-flopped. Because everybody knows who the Apostle Paul is. But had it not been for the Scriptures, you wouldn't know who King Agrippa is. You wouldn't know who Festus is. You wouldn't know who Felix is. These guys are almost not recorded at all in history. And what we find out is those people that think that they're something and they're the big wigs in the story of history, they're really the insignificant things. The person that's the most important here is the Apostle Paul, the servant of the Lord, the prisoner of Jesus Christ. And he had promised Paul he'd go to Rome, and the Lord, through all this, accomplished his plan. Then when we get into 26, Paul's going to give his testimony. He's going to be declared, this is stupid. Festus will be, Paul, you're mad. And Agrippa is going to say, you're a pretty convincing guy. You almost persuaded me to become a Christian. That's as far as it's going to go. And you know what they're going to decide? Had he not appealed to Caesar, he could have been set at liberty. But we'll have to get there next week. So let's go ahead and